Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. On today's podcast, I'm speaking to Dr Richard Fieldhouse, who's the chair of the National Association of Sessional GPs, about a range of issues relating to locum GPs. Coming up, we're talking about how many GPs are currently working as locums, the current state of the job market for locum GPs, and how this is impacting on the rates they are receiving for work. Richard also talks about what the NHS could do to make better use of locums, why being a locum is still a good career choice, and offers some advice for GPs starting out as locums and for practices on how they can get the best from their locum GPs. Just before we get started, if you are a GP doing locum work, we would really appreciate it if you could take the time to fill in our annual GP Online and GP Business locum rates survey, which asks about the rates locums charge for work and other issues that affect locum GPs. Everyone who completes the survey will be entered into a prize draw to win £250 of John Lewis vouchers, and all answers will remain strictly confidential. You can find a link to the survey in the notes for this episode. Thank you in advance for your help with this. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast now by Dr Richard Fieldhouse, who is chair of the National Association of Sessional GPs. Richard has been a GP locum for more than 20 years and he set up the NASGP in 1997. He's been active in GP politics for many years, lobbying on issues that affect locum GPs. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast again, Richard.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be back.
So, as I mentioned there, you've been on the podcast before, but it was actually quite a long time ago now, nearly 3 years ago. So for anyone listening who wasn't a listener back then or who doesn't know, can you explain a bit about what the NASGP is and why you set it up?
We've been around for 28 years and we're a national membership organisation for sessional GPs. So that's salaried GPs, GP locums, but really any portfolio GP, any GP who does jobs outside of also being a partner or a salaried role, and that can be out of hours, urgent care centres. The reason I set it up is because I just wanted to be a GP, but I was really, really struggling because in 1995, when I qualified, you just couldn't get a job. I went for multiple GP partnership jobs, just couldn't get them. And it was really, really hard finding locum work. It's very similar to what it is now. I think intuitively there were less GP locums in those days. But what I don't think hasn't changed that much is the GP training. My GP training back then did not in any way, shape or form prepare me for how tough it was to be a GP locum, how isolating it would be. My mindset was still institutionalised as being employed. But of course, when you're a GP locum, that's absolutely not the case. When you're a GP locum, you are self-employed contractor for services. You're hired by practices and you're not a cog fitting into a machine. When you qualify as a GP, your GMC license fundamentally changes. You're now fully responsible for everything you do for your prescribing. There is no line manager, so you have to have this independence. And I was finding that really, really tough. I felt very isolated. I felt I was in a position so often of enforced underperformance. Every practice was completely different to every other practice, certainly different to my training practice, but completely different to each other. And I was working in areas up the road which had different hospitals, different health authorities in those days. There were no induction packs or anything like that. So I set up the NASGP with 14 other GP locums. We all met up in the Midlands for a whole weekend. We put together a whole plan of action. In those days, GP locums also did not get the NHS pension. So we decided to lobby the government. We enlisted the help of the BMA who helped us, and we won pensions for locums. And we put together a standardised practice locum induction pack. We wrote a book. We started a membership organisation. We really started to help put locums on the map. And we, even after sort of 4 or 5 years of kind of ticking all the boxes of what we'd done, locums were still professionally isolated. So then we came up with the GP locum chambers model, an aspirational way for GP locums to work as part of a team with other locums in the area and actually become like a sense of belonging, give locums a sense of identity, the sum of all these different things that these chambers do to be greater than the sum of their parts and to actually really stand out locally as the go-to place for GP locums.
In terms of the locum workforce, I mean, the national GP workforce figures, they don't really pick up GP locums properly. It's obviously quite complicated because some GPs may work in other roles and take on locum shifts just in some of the time. But how many GPs in England and the UK as a whole do you think there are actually working in locum roles? What proportion of the workforce are they, do you think?
It's definitely not straightforward. NHS England has a sort of a voluntary way of counting locums that are in long-term positions, but it does not count the ad hoc side of things in any sort of scientific way. The GMC in a few years back came up with a method, and that's the method that we use. And we take the GMC database of fully qualified GPs who are practicing, i.e. GPs who are revalidated, and compare that to NHS England's own hard data for partners and salaried. And when we do that, what you come up with is numbers for salaried GPs, GP partners, and everyone else. At the moment, there were 18,000 GP partners, there were 18,000 salaried GPs, and 18,000 GPs who are not salaried or not partner. This is England. It's not so easy for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but I'm assuming the percentages are going to be pretty similar, i.e. 33%. And of that sort of group of GPs who are not salaried or partner, some of those will be exclusively prison doctor, military doctor, urgent care centre, or GP locuming. 10 years ago, it was really quite unusual to come across a GP locum who's also had a salaried role, but now that's almost the norm. So you've also got this very portfolio way of working where you have salaried GPs and even GP partners who are also topping up by doing extra locum sessions. In terms of potentially people GP locuming, it's probably even more than 18,000 in England alone. That's huge numbers, and that's just not numbers that NHS England really, I don't think, is in any way on top of.
Do you get a sense of over the last few years, is it rising or falling, or the number of locum GPs? Obviously, in the last sort of, 5 years or so, maybe a bit longer, we've really seen, like as you talked about, this explosion in portfolio working. So people who are GPs often have multiple jobs. That's not really very normal now to find someone who just does one job in one surgery and that's it.
According to the method of calculating numbers, actually the number of GP locums, the number of GPs who aren't partners or salaried, had increased by 4,000 earlier this year compared to pre-COVID. That's now dropped suddenly. And actually the number of GPs who are salaried has actually, the graph has been steadily rising. The GP partners has been steadily decreasing. But in the last year, there's been a slight uptick in salaried GPs and quite a marked downtick in GP locums. And like a lot of GP locums gone into salaried posts, or they've gone to Canada or Australia, New Zealand, or they've left and gone back into hospital and doing other roles, or just left altogether. Retired GP partners have just thought this is just too much hassle and have hung up their stethoscope.
That's something I wanted to talk to you about, because obviously the past year or so has really not been an easy time for locum GPs. We've reported a lot on GP Online about the jobs crisis that's meant many GPs are unable to find salaried GP posts, which we know is because of underfunding in general practice. How has that situation affected locum GPs? What are your members telling you about the amount of work that's available as a locum?
It's trying to triangulate what the message is. So from every GP locum we speak to, it's kind of back like it was in when I qualified. It was just really tough. And they've got to having to travel further. They're having to adjust the way they work. On our locum deck booking platform, locums are making themselves available up to a year in advance now, because the way that practices tend to work is when they do their holiday rotas, they tend to do those 12 months in advance. To get the locum bookings for those, they're making themselves available to be instant booked by the practices a year in advance. They're having to work a lot harder at being a GP locum. 2 or 3 years ago, and certainly pre-COVID, there was practices were desperate for locums, and it was very easy to get locum work. But now we're told that when a practice uses a jobs board type way of advertising, they're overwhelmed with responses. For a single session, they've got 30 odd plus responses. And those locums are on hold, waiting for that session to be booked, and sort of like a lottery. Or on WhatsApp, they get inundated with replies. It's not fit for purpose. There's no way to run a professional booking service by that sort of chaos, that Wild West way of doing things, which is one of the reasons we built our platform, Locum Day, which is completely opposite, which actually our platform goes along the normal ways of which a self-employed contractors work, is that our locums put all their available sessions onto the platform, and all the practice managers got to do 24/7 is just log on, usually with their smartphone, click and book, boom. And in the 6 ICBs where the ICBs have funded Locum Deck for all their locums, what we're finding for the last 3.5 years is the number of sessions booked by practices absolutely static. It's been 2.5 between those 6 ICBs. It's been 2,500 sessions booked every single month for 3 years. It hasn't changed. So despite underfunding, practices are still booking the same number of locums. What we've found, though, is it's the number of locums have gone up. There's way more locum sessions available than there used to be. Part of that is because there are more locums. I think also part of that is because there are salary GPs and even GP partners who are topping up their income by doing extra locum sessions or extra sessions on top of what they normally do, or doing internal cover, doing some overtime because of, cost of living to make up their salary. It's had a huge impact on GP locums.
Yeah. We ran a story on GP Online recently about the fact that locum rates are falling. Do you have a sense on what sort of fall in income locum GPs are experiencing and how it's affecting them?
We have this national Locum Deck platform, and it's not just for practices to put locums on, also for invoicing and paperless pension forms and all that sort of thing. So it has an awful lot of traffic. So taking the anonymised data from Locum Deck, we can very much see a locum rate trend since June 2020 when the platform started. And what we have very much is a sine wave, in that it started back in June 2020, the average rate was fairly flat. And then till about August 2021, the average of locum rates in all areas started to go up. They peaked in April, and the average over the last 5 years of Locum Deck is the average is £85 an hour. So there's quite a range and there's quite a regional variation as well. But the average locum rate peaked in February 23 at about £90 an hour. It's now currently at about £83 an hour. Certain areas like the Midlands, where rates have always been higher for some reason, compared to the Northwest, where they've always been a bit lower. 85% of the work is actually done on a sessional basis and invoiced on a sessional basis, but we average it out to an hourly rate for this purpose.
What sort of impact is that having on locum GPs?
The slightly lower rate is always going to have an impact. But then when your locum rate is slightly lower, you're going to potentially be more attractive to then be booked for longer or more sessions. So it's hard to draw a conclusion from a factor like that. And there's so many individual variances and people are affected in individual ways. The overall impact is not so much based on the hourly rate, which is more like it shows a sort of more of a correlation. It's much more about the actual overall less number of hours that the locums are able to work.
Has this meant that locum GPs have had to think again about their career choice? Are more of them looking for salaried posts now because of this? Or, are people looking for work outside of general practice, outside of the NHS?
Looking at the data, yes, certainly a lot more salaried posts have been filled, which would suggest that locums have then become salaried. And we've certainly heard from our members that they've stopped locuming and have now become salaried GPs. We've heard of our members who've moved to Canada. We haven't heard much from people taking up alternative careers, but certainly the need to do more out of hours and salaried posts has definitely been a common theme in a lot of our online chamber meetings, that's for sure.
What about private work for private providers? Because there's quite a lot of those sort of knocking around where people do sort of remote sessions potentially for private providers.
Remote and in person, a lot of the sort of the health insurance providers, that we hear that a lot, almost like scrabbling around to try and pick up a bit here and a bit there.
So what advice is the NASGP giving locum GPs in the current climate? Is there anything they can do themselves to kind of mitigate some of these issues and make sure they've got enough work or the amount of work that they need?
You've got to work hard at this. 5 years ago, you could be relatively passive about getting locum work. You'd be getting emails from practice managers and messages, and they'd be asking you to just carry on doing extra sessions and everything at their practice. So instead, it's about much more getting out there. Certainly on the Locum Deck platform, our strong advice to our members is, rather than make yourself available to be instant booked 2 to 3 months in advance, make that at least 6 months in advance, but even 12 months in advance. We've got plenty of members who've already been booked for next Christmas on Locum Deck. Also on the platform at the moment, it's totally free to practice, but we've got over 3,000 practices signed up on the platform. So in a lot of areas, locums can make themselves available to dozens and dozens of different practices. So the more you spread the wings out and kind of bite the bullet and increase how far and how long you are prepared to travel to get to a practice. Certainly in my early career, when I first started out, I was traveling an hour to an hour and a half to get to some practices because that's the only way back then to get work. I think it's improved a lot over the years, but I think we're kind of getting back to that stage again where it gets really tough. The way that platforms like ours work is that the practice managers, what they really want is a locum that they can trust, that will show up, will write good notes, will be clear and concise, and a strong attention to detail. And so we give locums a full opportunity to show themselves off on the platform by having a profile picture, by writing a really good, informative description of how they work, to upload all their documentation, to have it all there, so that when a practice manager is coming on to choose and book a locum, the ones with the full profile, where the CEOs have got a really nice, neat CV, it's clear and it's concise, that locum is going to write clear and concise clinical notes. That locum is going to hand over to patients really well. It's making yourself come across the practices in that powerful way, and give the practices the confidence that when they book you, they're getting a really good service from you, and that you're able to provide that. So it's about relationships. It's what all other sectors do. You've got to market yourself. I do up to 40 VTS talks a year, and my talk is on the mindset. VTS trainees, registrars are usually in their late 20s. They've spent a good proportion of their working lives as employees, and no one has ever told them that if they become a locum, they won't be employees anymore. They'll be like a firm of accountants, fully fledged business, and you've got to take that on board. And it's a lot of work and a lot of responsibility, really leaning into that and taking that on board. It's challenging, but it's also really good fun as well, and it's satisfying. It's a great job, but it takes effort. It won't just happen to you.
It wasn't so long ago that it was quite normal for people to qualify as a GP and then spend a certain proportion of time locuming just to kind of find out about maybe which practices they might want to work at in their local area, just to get a feel for life as a GP. Is that still a common route that people do after qualifying? I mean, obviously for international medical graduate GPs, there are issues around visas, so they are kind of precluded from that option. But do people still try and do that option before they settle down into a practice?
Certainly, I'm talking again pre-COVID, that was, a really popular part of your sort of career journey. And I think the college had some data where 50% of all newly qualified GPs were becoming GP locums during those first 5 years. And it's a brilliant way to transition from being a GP registrar in 2 or 3 really well high to spec training practices, to then work your way through working at practices that aren't training practices, and to look at what really fulfills you in your career and allows you to practice general practice in the way that you really enjoy, that really fulfills you. You might be the sort of GP who really loves underprivileged areas where you can really go out and make a huge difference. Or you might be the sort of GP who likes wealthier area where there are more services, where you're able to actually fulfill the demand kind of more easily and enjoy that side of things, or educate. In general practice is just so amazing at the different ways you can work. But I think now, though, we're much more on the back foot as newly qualified GPs. It's much more the priority is I need to pay off my student loan and have somewhere to live and not be redundant and put food on the table. So there's almost like a desperate scrabble in some quarters to just get work in any way possible. That's really sad when we've spent so much energy, and these newly qualified GPs have spent so much of their lives working so hard, taking a risk, be a public sector worker, and to work in a system that's basically underperforming in terms of the way it's funded and the waiting lists and all of those huge challenges, is when you actually then do qualify to then say, but no, I can't get a job. We're not in any way setting ourselves up as a country for the future by presiding over this really terrible situation. One of the greatest assets of the NHS is its workforce, and one of the biggest problems faced by the workforce is its welfare. And if you don't look after that, well, it's just not going to be around, is it?
It really is a catastrophic failure of workforce planning, really, without joining all the dots up, isn't it? Training all these extra GPs and then finding at the end of that, many of them are really struggling to get work. It's a really shocking state of affairs.
And it's crazy because, I mean, this time last year, Manchester University published a fantastic piece of research, and what they found was that the quality of care given by GP locums was comparable to that of GP partners and salary GPs. There were a few slight differences, but on balance, they were basically very similar. You've got a really high quality GP workforce out here who are not salaried, not partner, who are agile, flexible, can do a really good job. They can practice without supervision. It's taken them a lot of training to get that GMC license. And we're just here. You can absolutely get patients their appointments that they want so easily. It's just not happening because of funding and because of the churn and the chaos. And it's just, practices are just so busy, and they just don't have the resources to actually hire those GPs to cover those patient appointments.
Kind of leads me quite nicely onto my next question, actually, because when you were on the podcast last time, we talked about whether the NHS was making the most of locum GPs, and you felt that a lot more could be done. Has there been any progress on that over the last few years?
We speak a lot to the NHS England. We've got the biggest resource of GP locum data in the country. No one asks for it, but so we just send it out to them every month, whether they like it or not. We are really, really working very, very hard to show the people at NHS England what the data is looking like, and they have full access to all the live data. To be really fair to them, they are, when we do talk to people at NHS, they do listen really well. They do actually understand. They are in this position of power and responsibility, but they have little control. They're in this invidious place between the huge demands of the population and of primary care and secondary care, mixed with a government who just has got a massive hole in their pockets. I am sure politicians really love to fund the NHS. I think the current government particularly so. It's just the cash situation, the financial situation of the economy is just so dire at the moment. I'm not trying to be an apologist for the way the NHS is run, but there are certain realities there which form a background to the current show that we have.
Governments and NHS England to a certain extent often seem to see money spent on locum staff as a waste of money. And, there's often been a push to get more GPs into permanent roles. Do you think that's the wrong way of looking at it?
Yeah, totally wrong. At the moment, you've got 2/3 of GPs who are in substantive posts. There's a third of GPs who are not in substantive posts. They are not employees in GP practices. They might be doing some shifts in secondary care and urgent care centres, effectively secondary care for trusts and that sort of thing. And I really do think the role, ultimately, the commander's intent of a GP locum is to support GP practices. GP practices are where it happens. And being a GP partner is such a tough... I tried it once. It was a really, really tough job to take on the huge responsibilities of employing salary GPs and financial responsibilities as well. Because that's all a huge expense and it's huge responsibility for them. And actually, when you've got GP locums, these are GPs who do take on a lot of that risk themselves of not being employed, of paying for their own training, education, appraisal, sick leave, all that kind of stuff. And they take a big financial risk to do that, as is now currently being played out in the bank accounts of so many GP locums across the country. And research now shows, Manchester University, that we actually provide a really good service to patients. And I think continuity is an issue. As a profession, for many, many years, we have firmly nailed our flags to the post. But, we say, right, being a GP, it's all about continuity. If you don't do continuity, you're not a proper GP. This is the kind of message that comes across so often. And in order to boost that message, we've kind of done this confirmation bias thing. We've then gone out and done all the research to prove that continuity works. And it does. There is loads of evidence to show that continuity is really good for elderly patients and for chronic conditions. But we've not actually done any research to look at the side effects, the downsides of continuity. And one of those is exhaustion, ego depletion, compassion fatigue, burnout. So actually, a lot of the time, we're kind of failing to be that one thing we measure ourselves against. Whereas actually, I think in answer to your question, could the NHS be doing more? I think it needs to recognise that there is far more to being a GP than just ticking the continuity box and taking it for granted. Even as a GP locum, there's so much we do to support continuity. We keep those plates spinning. We're that fresh pair of eyes. We can give a second opinion as well. And we know how important second opinions can be. Over the last 20 years, there's been mountains of research come out. There's even Nobel Prizes have been awarded for behavioural psychology, where we now know there is evidence to know that particularly as professionals, we are very prone to making mistakes, to making assumptions, to making errors based on past experience. If we carry on seeing the same patient again and again, you're at risk of making errors based on assumptions about what you know about the patient, for example. And locums just cut straight through that, because if you see a patient for the first time, you're less susceptible to that. So it's getting NHS England and the GP profession to recognise, stay with continuity, that's wonderful. We've got to add other wonderful aspects of being a GP. You can't have continuity without access. If patients can't get to see a GP and they have to go to the urgent treatment centre, or you're putting your phones through to 111, you can't see them for weeks. That's not continuity. That's the opposite. You need to allow these patients to at least see a GP. Your GP locum might not have seen the patient before, but they're probably potentially a lot more wide open to other things. They might have experience of a wider healthcare system because they've not just been working in this practice all their career. They've worked in lots of different practices. They can bring best practice that they've picked up from other practices. They can be fresh, and that fresh approach. So there are lots of other evidence-based great things about being a GP locum. And if we can accept those, then, and be therefore much more open-minded to the GP workforce, not just being the GP partner in the same practice, seeing the same patient again and again and again. It's being much more agnostic, much more open to all the other wonderful aspects of general practice that GPs bring to the table.
Aside from extra funding for practices so they can actually afford to hire salary GPs and locum GPs, I mean, is there anything concrete you'd like to see coming out of an organisation like NHS England to help support the locum GP workforce more?
So I think what we're hearing more and more is just how difficult it can be in certain parts of the country to hire locums. When practices are in need of locums, as far as the practice knows, or the PCN or whatever, the only trick they've got in the book is WhatsApp. WhatsApp is a social media platform paid for by advertisers. It is not fit for purpose for a contract work when you want to hire a professional. You wouldn't book a babysitter using WhatsApp. We actually started building Locum Deck when there was a big uptick in the use of WhatsApp. WhatsApp is absolutely programmed to crash that sort of market because it is a race to the bottom. We need much more modern, smarter ways of enabling, of hiring, of booking, of very complex high risk transaction. A doctor working in a practice is it's high stakes. These practices are already different. They're already hard to work. So we make it such that the platform allows the practice to really set out how they work, and ditto for the locums, and allow that match to take place. It's not just booking a taxi. It's way more complex than that. That's why it's been so much hard work. But that's why the platform performs so incredibly well when we've got a thick market area like we have for those 6 ICBs that have already deployed it across all their practices.
Given what we've been talking about just generally today, is being a locum GP still a good career option in your view?
When it works, when you're in practice, it's a very satisfying way to give patients opinions, manage diagnosis. It's enjoyable, it can be fun, but you've got to work hard at it. Do not take it for granted as just turning up and being just the locum. But also keep an open mind. And I think whereas I think 5-6 years ago we would say yes, a GP locum career is a great option. I think now I'd caveat that with more, but keep your mind open in terms of more portfolio stuff as well. Keep your eye open for other options with PCNs, with education, with medical schools, with urgent treatment centres, with out of hours, with gypsy type work, setting yourself up to do minor op or special type of women's health clinic, for example, for practice. Make yourself available for practice to book you on that basis. Having an open mindset and being creative about what you can do as a person with the fantastic skills and training experience that you have. I just think there's a lot of GP locums out there thinking, what is all this for? Why am I doing this? They're having these existential conversations with themselves. And I completely understand that. And I've had that in the past too. But if you can hang on in there, I think times will improve again. Things do turn around. Things do come and go. The market does waver. That's just any type of service provider market. And guys, that's what you're in. You are service providers as locums. You're not employees. Markets do turn around and things do improve and opportunities will come up. And stick with it. It's a great career. There are other jobs out there. They might sound more lucrative, but there's a lot of satisfaction comes with being a GP. So if you can, you will be needed.
What other advice? Is there any key bits of advice apart from that you'd give to maybe younger GPs listening to this who might want to start out working as a locum?
If there's a locum chambers near you, that'll be my first port of call. We as NASGP have got really active locum networks across Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Essex. They are really worth joining, but also we can set up chambers for any locum in an area. We don't charge for it. What we simply do is act as an introduction. Once you've got about 10, 15 locums in an area as a team like this, then there'll naturally be one or two of you who are very keen to sort of then help facilitate that group and give it that real sense of belonging and community. Because it can be so isolating working as a GP locum, having that sense of community, having colleagues to talk to have that psychological safety with, where if you're having issues or problems, you've got to have that. So that would be one thing I would suggest. As a GP locum, you've got to think differently to being an employee. You have to think you're actually now your own business, self-employed GP, but you've got to think of it in those terms, in terms of how you then hire yourself out to be engaged for clinical sessions by practices.
What advice would you give to practices so that they can get the most out of their locums?
A few years back, we were commissioned by an ICB in northwest London to go and talk to loads of locums and loads of practice managers and find out sort of the answer to this question. What we found is that if a locum was going to work for a practice that did kind of 5 things. Make sure that locum has local information. They've got a locum induction pack. So when they're working at your practice, every practice is different to every practice by actually 500 different practice-specific ways of doing things. But give them the top 20, give them the top 30 in an induction pack. Keep that up to date so they've got knowledge and information, baseline, basic stuff, where the loos are, where the defib is, how to organise an ECG, what to tell the patients when you do blood tests, that kind of thing. The second thing is sort of the management level type stuff. So when they invoice you, acknowledge it and pay it on time and sign their pension forms. Simple stuff. I'm sure you do that anyway, but there are practices who don't pay locums on time. So pay them on time and confirm the sessions with them. The third thing is about community, is about feeling part of a team. When the locum turns up, get someone to pop in and say hello and tell them when the tea break is. And if you don't have a tea break, please start having tea breaks in your practice. In my experience as a GP locum, who's worked in 100 different practices, I find the best quality of care is given by practices who stop for a tea break. No science to that. The fourth thing is don't just give them feedback, but ask them for their feedback. Make them feel that you are interested in hearing about what their experience has been like whilst working at that practice, and allow them to give their feedback to you, because locums can be working in up to 30 different practices. The access they have gives them an incredible, unique insight into the operations of a practice and a PCN of neighbourhoods and of areas. Use that. The fifth thing is, if there are any opportunities in your practice, if you've got a partnership coming up or a salaried post, or you've heard of something else on the grapevine or another practice struggling, just talk to them about it. Those 5 things, if they're not done or if they're done badly, when we were in London, this is again pre-COVID, we were talking to lots of practice managers, lots of locums. What we found is that when a locum was working in a practice where this happened, the rates that they were charging compared to the rates that the locums working in practices which didn't say hello, that didn't give them a locum induction pack, that just basically ignored them, then the rates they were charging were almost double what they were charging for the other practice. The way your relationship is with locums in your practice really makes a huge impact on the rates that they will charge. And so it's making locums feel part of the team that can make such a big difference to all sorts of outcomes.
No, that's really, really good advice for practices, that. All right, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Richard. Thank you.
Not at all. Great questions. I hope that was all right.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and thanks so much to Richard for taking the time to talk with me. I'll be back next week for our regular news review, so please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources, including advice and information for locum GPs, on our website at GPonline.com.